The fog on Dorset Street was more than just weather. It was a physical manifestation of the moral obscurity that clung to London's Whitechapel district in 1888. In the dim, gas-lit haze, the line between survival and sin was not just blurred, it was erased. This is where our story begins, not in the grand parlours of Victorian respectability, but in the single rented room of Mary Kelly at 13 Miller's Court, a place where dreams came to die. At 25, traces of the beauty that had once carried her from Ireland to London with hopes of domestic service still flickered across her face. But they were ghosts, haunting the features of a woman now trapped. Her story was a common one, a relentless economic equation where the solution, for thousands of women, was the sale of their own bodies. Victorian Britain preached morality from its pulpits, but its economic engine was lubricated by the desperation of women who had no legal rights, no property, and no escape from the grim arithmetic of poverty. Mary Kelly's descent was not a fall from grace, but a slow, grinding slide into an industry built on society's hypocrisy. She was one of an estimated 80,000 to 120,000 prostitutes in London alone, a staggering figure documented by the prominent physician Dr. William Acton in 1857. His clinical report could not mask the human tragedy behind the numbers. He noted that the great bulk of prostitutes in this country are in all probability daughters of tradesmen of the lower class, domestic servants, and women who have been employed in various kinds of manual labor. These were not a separate class of fallen beings, but sisters, daughters, and mothers who had run out of options. They were casualties of an industrial age that offered women starvation wages in return for backbreaking labor, leaving prostitution not as a choice of vice, but as a rational decision for survival. Consider the life of Catherine Kate Eddowes, born in 1842. She had known legitimate work as a tin plate stamper, but economic hardship had driven her to the common lodging houses of the East End. On September 30th, 1888, she was released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 in the morning. She had 4p in her pocket, enough for a bed, but she needed more for food, and so she made the calculated decision to walk toward the narrow, shadowed streets where a few coins could be earned. She was not part of an established brothel with any measure of protection. She was a casual laborer in the vast, dangerous gig economy of survival sex. Unbeknownst to her, that decision would etch her name into history as a canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, but her final hours illuminate a reality far more common than a serial killer's blade: the daily, grinding precariousness of existence for women on the edge. The distinction between a woman working in a regulated brothel and one like Kate Eddowes walking the streets was a chasm. Established brothels, from the luxurious houses of Street John's Wood to the grim hovels of Whitechapel, offered a perverse form of security. They provided shelter, food, and a madam who, for purely financial reasons, had an interest in keeping her workers alive and functional. The women who walked the streets independently faced the elements, police harassment, and predatory violence with no safety net whatsoever. Theirs was a life of constant calculation, where every potential client was a risk that had to be weighed against the gnawing ache of hunger or the desperation for a roof. The diaries of women like Hannah Culwick, a domestic servant born in 1833, provide a stark window into the economic pressures that made the brothel or the street seem like a viable alternative. As a maid of all work, she rose at 5 a.m. to light fires, scrub steps, and perform relentless labor for wages that rarely exceeded £12 per year. In an 1860 diary entry, she wrote, "My hands are so raw they've started bleeding again, but I daren't complain for fear of losing my place." Her greatest fear was that of her predecessor. Margaret, who worked at the house before me, went on the streets after she fell ill and couldn't work. I pray daily that won't be my fate. For a Victorian working-class woman, a single missed week of wages due to illness could trigger an inescapable downward spiral into destitution. This desperation was amplified exponentially for single mothers. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act had abolished outdoor relief for able-bodied adults, forcing the destitute into the dreaded workhouse, where families were torn apart. Faced with the prospect of losing her children forever, many a mother saw prostitution as the lesser of two horrific evils. Social investigator Sarah Wise recorded the testimony of Ellen, a 8-year-old mother of 3. "I'd rather die than see my babies in the workhouse. When my husband died of consumption, I tried to keep us going with washing and mending, but I couldn't earn enough. The rent man don't care if you've got hungry babies. He wants his money every week, same as always." Ellen's story, from a basement room in the Seven Dials Rookery, was one of millions. She charged 6p per client, the equivalent of an hour's wage for a skilled craftsman. On a good night, she might see 3 or 4 men. On a bad night, None. In this bleak mathematics of survival, morality was a luxury she could not afford. The story of Annie Chapman, born around 1840, perfectly encapsulates this brutal calculus. Once the wife of a coachman, living respectably in Windsor, her husband's death left her with nothing. By 1888, she was in Spitalfields, drifting between casual prostitution and selling matches. Her life revolved around the nightly need for fourpence to secure a bed in a common lodging house. The deputy keeper of Crossingham's lodging house, Timothy Donovan, later testified about her final days. She was a quiet woman, he said, always tried to pay her way, though sometimes she'd be short. On the night of September 7th, 1888, she was ill, suffering from a consumptive cough, and couldn't raise the money. Donovan found her in the kitchen around 2 a.m. "I can't let you stay here without paying," he told her, his reluctance evident. "I'll be back soon," Annie replied, pulling a thin shawl around her shoulders before walking into the darkness of Dorset Street. She was found murdered 6 hours later in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, her body bearing the brutal marks that would make her the Ripper's second confirmed victim. Her death was a tragic endpoint in a life defined by economic desperation, a single violent data point in a vast, silent epidemic of suffering. Behind the respectable facades of Victorian London, from the elegant townhouses of Chelsea to the soot-stained brick of Whitechapel, lay a parallel economy of desire and despair, meticulously structured and brutally efficient. While the streetwalkers like Annie Chapman battled the elements and anonymity, another world existed behind closed doors. The Victorian brothel. This was not a monolith, but a rigid hierarchy, a pyramid of exploitation where the luxury at the top was funded by the degradation at the bottom. At its peak were establishments like those run by the infamous Mrs. Jeffries, where wealthy clients paid premium prices for an illusion, the seduction of seemingly respectable ladies in opulent settings furnished with red velvet and fine china. Yet, even here, beneath the surface of piano music and excellent claret, lay the same system of debt, bondage, and psychological control that trapped women just as effectively as poverty trapped them on the streets. The high-class brothels of districts like Street John's Wood operated with a veneer of legitimacy, often protected by discreet bribes to police and local officials. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who would later lead the Ripper investigation, found his hands tied when raiding such properties. The women were well-dressed, well-fed, and consistently refused to testify against their employers. In his official report, Aberline pinpointed the core hypocrisy. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between voluntary and involuntary participation. When the alternatives facing these women are so limited, they may choose to remain, but their choices are constrained by circumstances that leave them few options for legitimate employment. This was the brothel's open secret. A woman's apparent consent was often a calculated assessment of survival in a society that offered her no real alternatives. For the women inside, the reality was far from glamorous. They typically incurred substantial debts to the madam for clothing, room, board, and any required medical care. These debts, calculated at inflated rates, could take years to repay, accruing interest that ensured permanent financial servitude. It was a gilded cage, where the comforts were merely tools for control. The diary of Alice Mitchell, who worked in a mid-tier brothel in Pimlico during the 1880 seconds, provides a heartbreaking first-hand account of the psychological erosion this system caused. Rose New Girl Today. Alice wrote on October 12, 1883, hardly more than a child, maybe 16 at most. Mrs. Henderson took her in, gave her a bath, and a proper dress. Girl thinks she's been saved. Doesn't understand yet what's expected. I remember feeling grateful too, at first. This sense of rescue was the madam's most powerful recruitment tool, transforming exploitation into perceived salvation for girls fresh from the workhouse or the streets. Alice's writings document the mental gymnastics required to endure this life. We tell ourselves stories to make it bearable. She confessed in a later entry that we're actresses playing roles, that the men who visit us are kind gentlemen. Some girls convince themselves they're saving money to start legitimate businesses or find respectable husbands. I used to dream of opening a little shop selling ribbons and lace. Now I know better, but the dreams helped for a while. This self-deception was a necessary coping mechanism, but it grew harder to maintain over time. A later entry from March 3rd, 1885, reveals her growing distress as she witnesses the cycle repeat with ever younger girls. Mrs. Henderson brought in 2 girls today who looked barely 14. They're so grateful they'd probably do anything she asked. It makes me sick to watch. Want to warn them, but what good would it do? Where else would they go? Alice's moral turmoil highlights a grim truth. The brothel system preyed on the most vulnerable, using kindness as a hook and desperation as the line. This systemic exploitation was exposed to the shocked public by W.T. Stead, the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, in his explosive 1885 investigative series, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. Stead deliberately purchased a young girl to demonstrate how easily children could be trafficked into London's brothels, writing, "I have purchased the persons of these children to demonstrate how easily such transactions can be accomplished in Christian England." His sensational journalism, backed by the testimony of reformers like Rebecca Jarrett, a former prostitute, led directly to the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which raised the age of consent from 13 to 16. Yet, as Jarrett testified to a parliamentary commission, the problem was deeper than the law. They target girls at their most vulnerable moments, she explained, newly orphaned or thrown out of employment, offer them food, shelter, pretty clothes. By the time they understand what's expected in return, they're already trapped by debt and dependency. The medical consequences of life inside these establishments were documented with clinical precision by physicians like Dr. James Miller, who worked in London's East End. His patient records from the Royal London Hospital tell a story of chronic violence and neglect. One entry for a 17-year-old named Agnes M. reads, "Severe lacerations to genital area consistent with violent assault, malnutrition evident, symptoms consistent with consumption. Dr. Miller saw the same patterns repeatedly. Venereal diseases spread without effective treatments. Violence from customers went unpunished, and malnutrition weakened bodies already besieged by stress." In a letter to a colleague, he challenged the moralistic view of his time, writing, "The women who come to me are not the wicked creatures portrayed in moral tracts. They are human beings ground down by circumstances beyond their control. I treat their injuries and diseases, but I cannot treat the poverty and desperation that brought them to my surgery." His perspective laid bare the fiction that prostitution was a moral choice. It was, first and foremost, a health crisis born of an economic one. If the Victorian brothel was a gilded trap for women, it was a living hell for children. The true depth of the system's corruption is revealed not only in the exploitation of women, but in its insidious reach into the next generation. While reformers like Josephine Butler fought for the souls of women, a more horrifying truth was festering in the shadows. The widespread trafficking of young girls, some barely into their teens, who represented the ultimate commodity in this economy of desperation. This was the darkest chamber of Victorian vice, a trade in innocence that respectable society struggled to even acknowledge, let alone stop. The crusade to expose it would require sensational journalism, reveal international criminal networks, and force a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that the most vulnerable were being consumed by the very same system that pretended to uphold moral virtue. The man who ripped the veil off this atrocity was W.T. Stead, the fearless editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. In 1885, he published The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, a series of articles that detonated a bomb of public outrage. To prove his point, Stead personally orchestrated the purchase of a 13-year-old girl named Eliza Armstrong for £5, documenting the chilling ease with which a child could be bought for a life of prostitution. "I have purchased the persons of these children," he wrote, "not for my own base purposes, but to demonstrate how easily such transactions can be accomplished in Christian England." His prose was purple and deliberately shocking, describing a flesh market where virgins were highly prized. The public was horrified, and the resulting uproar directly led to the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which raised the age of consent to 16. Yet, as the initial shock faded, it became clear that a law could not eradicate the deep-seated economic desperation that created the supply of vulnerable children. The methods of the traffickers were sophisticated and cruel, relying on psychological manipulation rather than brute force. Rebecca Jarrett, a former prostitute turned reformer who assisted Stead's investigation, provided stark testimony to a parliamentary commission. "They target girls at their most vulnerable moments," she explained, "when they're newly orphaned or thrown out of employment or running from violent homes. They offer them food, shelter, pretty clothes, things they've never had. By the time they understand what's expected in return, they're already trapped by debt and dependency." These recruiters, often women themselves, operated as friendly faces in a hostile world. They haunted workhouse gates, docks where immigrant ships landed, and factory districts, offering solutions to immediate crises. In Liverpool, Rebecca noted, recruiters specifically watched ships from Ireland, approaching young women traveling alone with offers of legitimate work in London or Manchester. The girls, trusting a kindly, respectable-seeming woman, had no idea they were being delivered into sexual slavery. This was not merely a local issue. It was an international enterprise. Police records from the 1,880 seconds, including those of Inspector Edmund Reed in Whitechapel, document a coordinated network that moved women and girls across national borders. Reed noted the frequent presence of foreign women in London establishments, many who spoke little English and were terrified of returning home. One case involved Marie, a 17-year-old from Belgium, who had been promised work as a housemaid. Instead, she found herself in a Whitechapel brothel, told she owed a crippling debt for her transportation and accommodation. When questioned about returning home, Reed wrote, Marie became extremely agitated and claimed her family believed she was working respectably in England. She feared that returning home would bring disgrace on her siblings. This weaponization of shame and family honor was a powerful tool, ensuring that even those who could physically escape felt they had nowhere to go. For the children who were born into this system, the tragedy was compounded. Some brothels forbade women from keeping their children on the premises, forcing mothers to make an impossible choice: abandon their offspring or lose their only income. Others allowed children to stay, exposing them to environments that were psychologically scarring. Feminist investigator Frances Power Cobbe documented these little slaves of England in an 1884 pamphlet. She described an 8-year-old boy named Tommy who had lived his entire life in the brothel where his mother worked. He cannot read or write, Cobbe wrote, has never attended school and possesses no understanding of life beyond these rooms. During business hours he hides in the cellar or attic. His mother loves him deeply but sees no way to provide him with a different life. These children grew up with a premature, warped understanding of adult sexuality, yet were deprived of the basic education and social skills needed for any legitimate future. The boys often became procurers. The girls almost inevitably followed their mothers into the trade, perpetuating a generational cycle of exploitation. For the women who did manage to escape, the battle was far from over. The social stigma was a life sentence. Philanthropist Louisa Twining, who established refuge homes for women leaving prostitution, documented the immense challenges they faced. Respectable employers will not hire women with histories of prostitution, regardless of their current circumstances or desires for reform, she wrote in an 1879 report. Her refuge house records tell stories of heartbreaking relapse. Sarah came to us in 1877, Twining recorded, determined to reform. She was intelligent, well-spoken, and possessed genuine skills in needlework. But after months of searching, no household would employ her. She left our refuge eventually, saying she couldn't survive on the pittance earned doing washing for charitable organizations. We never saw her again. Sarah's story illustrates the cruel paradox of Victorian morality. Society condemned the prostitute for her sin while systematically denying her every opportunity for redemption. The door to a respectable life was bolted shut from the outside, leaving the brothel as the only place where a woman could earn enough to survive. For the women of Victorian London's underworld, violence was not a sporadic terror but a constant, occupational hazard, a spectrum of harm that ranged from daily brutality to the theatrical mutilations of a serial killer. The story of their suffering is not just about the knife of Jack the Ripper, but about the thousands of smaller cuts, the beatings, the rapes, the neglect that defined their existence long before they met their infamous end. While the Ripper's crimes shocked the world into temporary awareness, they were merely the most extreme manifestation of a violence that was woven into the very fabric of their lives. A violence that was often ignored, excused, or met with a resigned shrug by the authorities and the public alike. To understand the Autumn of Terror in 1888, one must first understand the relentless backdrop of mundane suffering against which it played out. The economic reality of survival sex work created a powerful incentive to endure abuse in silence. Women knew that reporting a violent customer to the police would brand them as troublesome, jeopardizing their precarious income. The testimony of a woman named Ellen, who knew the murdered Francis Coles, laid this brutal calculus bare. Francis was afraid to name the men who hurt her, Ellen stated. She said it would only make things worse if she caused trouble for customers. Better to take the beating and hope for gentler treatment next time. We all understood that reasoning. Complaining about violence just made you seem like trouble. And troublesome women don't get customers. This was a world where a black eye was preferable to homelessness. where the immediate need for fourpence for a bed overrode the long-term risk of assault. This grim reality was witnessed daily by policemen on the beat, like Constable George Godley, who patrolled Whitechapel. His unofficial notes reveal a ground-level view that often conflicted with official policy. "Most of the women I know, by name and circumstance," Godley wrote in 1888, "they're not criminals in any ordinary sense, just poor souls trying to survive. I arrest them when required by law, but it solves nothing. They pay their fines and return to the streets the same night because they have no alternatives." His personal connection to the victims adds a layer of tragic foreshadowing. He noted of Elizabeth Stride, "I've watched her health decline over the past year. Coughs constantly, too thin, but still walks the streets every night because she needs the money for lodging." For officers like Godley, the women were not anonymous fallen creatures, but human beings caught in an inescapable trap. Rare first-hand accounts from survivors who lived to tell their story provide a chilling glimpse into the patterns of this violence. Annie Millwood, who survived a vicious knife attack in February 1888, gave a statement to Inspector Reed that was a blueprint for the horrors to come. "He seemed like a gentleman at first," Annie recounted. "Well-dressed, polite. I should have known better. The real gentlemen don't pick up women on Commercial Street, but I needed the money. Once alone, his manner transformed. Started talking about cleansing the streets of filth like me," she said. "Said he was doing God's work. If that constable hadn't heard me screaming, I'd be dead like the others." Annie's testimony is crucial. It reveals that the Ripper's modus operandi, the feigned respectability, the moralistic rhetoric justifying violence was likely not unique to him. Her survival was an anomaly. For every Annie Millwood, there were undoubtedly countless others who did not survive their encounters to report them. When the Ripper's killings began, they forced a temporary glaring spotlight onto this normalized violence. The post-mortem reports of police surgeons like Dr. Thomas Bond and Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, while focused on the spectacular cause of death, also provided clinical evidence of the chronic damage these women had already sustained. Of Catherine Eddowes, Dr. Brown noted extensive evidence of chronic kidney disease, liver damage consistent with prolonged alcohol consumption, and scarring on hands and forearms suggesting defensive wounds from previous attacks. Regarding Mary Ann Nichols, he observed symptoms of advanced syphilis, tooth loss from poor nutrition, and a chronic respiratory infection. Their professional conclusion was stark. These women are dying by degrees long before they encounter violent death. The Ripper's knife was merely the final dramatic blow to bodies and spirits already broken by years of deprivation, disease, and routine harm. The public and press reaction to the murders further highlighted the low value placed on these women's lives. Initial reports, like that in the Times regarding Elizabeth Stride, casually dismissed the victim as a woman of dissolute character, thereby subtly implying her lifestyle had invited the violence. This stood in stark contrast to the outrage that would have followed the murder of a respectable middle-class woman. It was left to voices like George Bernard Shaw, writing in The Star, to connect the murders to their social context. The Whitechapel murders are not the work of a monster, he argued, but the inevitable result of a social system that creates monsters by denying basic dignity and security to the most vulnerable. This perspective was radical because it shifted the blame from an individual fiend to the systemic failure that made women like Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, and Elizabeth Stride so utterly vulnerable in the first place. Their deaths were not an interruption of the natural order, but a logical, if extreme, consequence of it. The gaslights of Whitechapel have long been extinguished. The specific horrors of 1888 faded into history books. But to believe the system described in those pages is a relic of the past is to misunderstand its fundamental nature. The Victorian engine of exploitation did not vanish. It evolved, adapting its form to new technologies and social mores while retaining its core function. The desperate calculations made by Mary Kelly, the brutal economics documented by Dr. Miller, and the societal hypocrisy exposed by Josephine Butler did not end with the Victorian era. They persist, echoing in the digital marketplaces, unmarked massage parlors, and shadowed streets of our modern cities. The names and the scenery have changed, but the ancient mathematics of desperation, where poverty on one side meets desire on the other, bridged by exploitation, remains tragically unchanged. Walk through any major city today, and you will find the direct descendants of Mrs. Jeffreys's high-class establishment and the squalid lodging houses of Miller's Court. The elegant townhouses have been replaced by discreet upscale apartments advertised on encrypted apps, where the transaction is sanitized by technology. The streetwalkers of Commercial Street now operate in designated red light districts or through online classifieds, their vulnerability now layered with the digital threat of hackers and stalkers. The gin palaces that lured Martha Tabram have been supplanted by neon-lit strip clubs and bars, where intoxication still lowers inhibitions and creates targets for predators. The system has simply become more efficient, more globalized, and more easily ignored by a society that, like its Victorian predecessor, prefers to moralize about individual choice, rather than confront the systemic failures that create the supply of vulnerable individuals. The international trafficking networks so meticulously documented by Inspector Edmund Reed and Salvation Army workers like Catherine Bramwell Booth have exploded in scale and sophistication. Where young women like Marie from Belgium were once tricked with promises of domestic work, modern traffickers use fake modeling contracts, offers of nanny positions, or sham marriages to move victims across borders. The psychological control remains the same: the weaponization of debt, the isolation in a foreign country, the confiscation of passports, and the pervasive fear of shame that prevents them from seeking help. The 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act was a well-intentioned but feeble response to this global trade, just as many modern anti-trafficking laws struggle to keep pace with criminal ingenuity and the vast profits to be made. Perhaps the most damning continuity is the persistence of the same economic logic that forced Annie Chapman onto the streets. Today, a single mother facing eviction, a student buried under debt, or a worker whose factory has closed down still faces a limited menu of bleak options. The modern equivalent of the workhouse, the welfare system, with its complex barriers and meager benefits, can feel just as punitive. When the choice is between homelessness and a transaction that pays the rent, the decision remains one of brutal pragmatism, not moral failing. The testimony of Ellen, the Victorian mother of 3 who declared, "I'd rather die than see my babies in the workhouse," finds its modern parallel in the stories of women who enter the sex trade to keep their children fed and sheltered, their choices constrained by the same lack of viable alternatives. Society's response, too, mirrors Victorian hypocrisy. We criminalize the women, the sellers, while often turning a blind eye to the demand from the buyers, the modern respectable gentleman. Police resources are poured into periodic raids on brothels or sweeps of streetwalkers, a cycle as futile as Constable George Godley's arrests that solve nothing. The underlying issues, poverty, housing insecurity, lack of education, and mental health crises remain largely unaddressed. We maintain the comfortable fiction that those in the sex trade are a separate class, others who have made bad choices, allowing us to avoid the uncomfortable truth that they are a symptom of our collective failure to provide genuine safety nets and opportunities for all. As our journey through these shadowed streets concludes, we are left with a final, unsettling reflection. The real horror of the Victorian brothel was not just the individual suffering within its walls, but how perfectly it served the society that pretended to condemn it. It channeled male desire toward disposable women, thereby preserving the sanctity of the middle-class home and the myth of universal female virtue. Our modern system serves a similar purpose. It allows us to consume the fantasy of freely given sexuality while ignoring the economic coercion that often underpins it. It lets us believe in a world of equal opportunity, while a parallel economy thrives on inequality. The women we have followed, Mary, Annie, Kate, and Elizabeth, were not anomalies. They were the canaries in the coal mine of an industrial society that valued respectability over humanity. Their ghosts do not merely linger in the history of Whitechapel. They walk among us today, in different clothes and circumstances, silently testifying to an exploitation that we have yet to conquer. Thank you for joining me on this deep and often dark exploration of a hidden world. If this journey through history has given you a new perspective, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more content that uncovers the forgotten truths of our past. I am continually amazed that we can connect across time and space, exploring these profound stories together. Let me know in the comments what part of this history resonated most with you.